All right, welcome everyone. So glad that you can be here today. My name is Jesse Wheeler with Friends of Sabeel North America. I just have some small comments, and then we will get started very quickly. And so, first, we're all calling in from very different places, but I do feel it's important to acknowledge the land that we are on. Because I am calling in from the unceded Ohlone territory, otherwise known as where this bridge is. And if you want to share a bit about your name, where you're from in the chat, more than welcome to do that. Just really started just some basic housekeeping. The session is being recorded, so plan accordingly as far as maybe your picture, image, it's always something to consider. We will have a question and answer towards the end, and we're going to utilize the chat function for that. So please, any questions you have, the chat function is there, go in. And also, if you are interested in making some comments in the chat as we go through, that is perfectly fine. Just know that there are some expectations and you can't go wrong with the golden rule. Do to others as you would want to do for you, and if it gets to the point, I will take the executive decision to kick people out if they aren't, if some of the top, if the golden rule is not being followed. So right now we're here for, I'm representing Friends of Sabeel North America, and we're sponsoring this. So as a Christian Voice for Palestine, we are an interdenominational Christian organization that seeks justice and peace in the Holy Land through education, advocacy, and nonviolent action. And actually here to give a bit of an introduction is our executive director, Jonathan Kutab. So, Jonathan, please.
Well, hello and welcome everybody. I'm so pleased that we have over 120 people now who are following us. Many of them old friends and many are new. We're glad to have you all join in this effort. The obligation to confront and deal with Christian Zionism has always been a very important part of the work of Sabeel itself, as well as FOSNA. And the reason is, first, because it's theologically incorrect. So we have a spiritual duty to correct misinterpretation of scripture. But secondly, and maybe more importantly, is that this interpretation that's called Christian Zionism is not only theologically false and probably a heresy, but it's also being weaponized to justify the oppression of the Palestinian people, to justify working for war rather than peace, to justify losing hope in the possibility of reconciliation between Palestinians and Israelis, is weaponized to justify sending weapons to Israel, as well as justifying the genocide and ethnic cleansing of Palestine. It's amazing because I think maybe not since slavery and Jim Crow have we ever had biblical teachings and biblical texts used in such a negative way to support oppression of other people. So we have a duty to deal with Christian Zionism, and I'm very glad that FOSNA, which had been very involved in creating this institution, is now sort of turning it over to very capable hands so that we can have an ongoing resource whose only focus is dealing with Christian Zionism. So I welcome you all, and I leave you in the good hands of Jesse and Mimi and our very distinguished panelists. Welcome, one and all.
Thank you so much, Jonathan and Jesse. And my sincere thanks to FOSNA for all the support it has given the Institute for the Study of Christian Zionism, or ISCZ. I'm Mimi Kirk, director of this new institute. I'm just going to speak for a couple of minutes about ISCZ and then introduce our three speakers. So this webinar, Christian Zionism and the Interruption of Black-Palestinian Solidarity, marks the launch of the Institute for the Study of Christian Zionism and is linked to Dr. Atalia Omer's article in the first issue of the Institute's affiliated journal, aptly called the Journal for the Study of Christian Zionism. The first journal issue is being designed into a PDF that will be available for download in the coming days on our website, and that's studychristianzionism.org. I'll put that in the chat. And the Institute aspires to be the primary resource for the study, critique, and response to Christian Zionism, the first place people turn for anything and everything to do with this destructive ideology. And this work feels all the more important in the present moment when we are seeing the horrific repercussions of Zionism and Christian Zionism in Gaza and beyond. As for ISCZ's work, it will publish its journal biannually and also features a blog and other critical resources. We also plan to hold more webinars like this one and are working on a digital lending library, podcast, and other initiatives. We hope you'll join us for all of them and spread the word. Okay, so let me introduce our speakers. Dr. Omer will speak for about 20 minutes, followed by a discussion with Dr. Gamedze and Dr. Raheb, Reverend Dr. Raheb. We'll then open things up for a Q&A with the audience. And as Jesse said, please post your questions in the chat, and I'll aim to get to as many of them as possible. So first, Dr. Atalia Omer is professor at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies and the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame. She also recently served as a senior fellow and visiting professor at Harvard University's Religion and Public Life program. Her research focuses on religion, violence, and peace building, as well as theories and methods in the study of religion. Dr. Omer was awarded an Andrew Carnegie Fellowship in 2017, resulting in her latest book, Decolonizing Religion and Peacebuilding, from Oxford University Press. Dr. Thandi Gamedze is a South African educator, a writer, and a poet. She works across churches, universities, and NGOs in South Africa, and is driven by a deep commitment to critique and reimagine a world that is just, nurturing, and kind. Reverend Dr. Mitri Raheb is president of Al-Kalima University in Bethlehem, the most widely published Palestinian theologian to date. He's the author or editor of 50 books, including his latest, Decolonizing Palestine, the Land, the People, the Bible, from Orbis Books. Okay, we are so lucky to have this incredible panel. Dr. Omer, Atalia, you have the floor. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Fosna and Mimi, and really it's a great honor to be a part of the launch of such a significant and important undertaking. It is also amazing to be on a panel with two people I admire, Dr. Mitri Raheb and Dr. Thandi Gamedze. I also just shout out that in the first issue of the journal on Christian Zionism, there is a review of Dr. Raheb's excellent book on settler colonialism in reference to Palestine. So I really highly recommend reading it. So I will present on a paper on the article that is forthcoming in this first issue of the journal of the Institute. The article is titled "Selling Biblical Fantasies: How Jewish and Christian Zionists Interrupt Black Palestinian Solidarity." I wrote this article together with the help of my research assistant and undergraduate student at the University of Notre Dame, James William Thompson. So shout out to James. The article examines hasbara. Literally, it means explaining things, but in the article, we examine technologies of hasbara that are used to manufacture non-organic Black American Christian Zionism. Throughout the article, we use hasbara as kind of a shorthand to denote the convergences of actors, institutions, public diplomacy, and other Zionist agendas or actors who opportunistically benefit from promoting such agenda. Christian and Jewish Zionist organizations and actors seek to deflate the symbolic, metaphorical power of the liberation of Palestine for formerly and currently colonized and racialized people. Therefore, hasbara's relationship building programs and advocacy seek to manufacture Jewish-Black solidarity. And this is beyond, it goes beyond just the kind of the theological, the heresy that was discussed earlier by Jonathan Kutab. Worried about a narrative loss and the organic ties of these organic ties marginalized and racialized Americans experience vis-a-vis Palestinian struggle, hasbara, despite its increased association with white Christian nationalists, seek to convince Black and Brown, in addition to LGBTQI+ and other marginalized communities around the world, that Zionism and Israel embody anti-racism and share an affinity with Black and other struggles of marginalized people. The Zionist spin of aggression and oppression as victimhood and self-defense gaslights Palestinian experiences and manipulates the biblical imaginations about Jews. Based on a scrutiny of testimonies and promotional material and social media presence and other sources of Zionist actors that target actively Black American sectors as part of a broader Global South strategy, our findings suggest that the more Zionist Black churches and publics are, the less politicized they are on racism in the US context, which is the focus of this article. In other words, it is in the interest of white supremacist agendas to redirect, often through underwriting, a variety of Holy Land excursions, or Holy Land in quotes, excursions and other solidarity activities, Black churches toward Zionism. Black Christian Zionism then also offers kind of a fig leaf for Jewish Zionist convergences with white nationalists and neoconservative forces, specifically through the contextualized retrieval of Martin Luther King Jr.'s Zionist legacy. So in the article, we first examined the collusion of hasbara with white Christian nationalisms and neoconservative forces. I'm not going to speak so much about it in this presentation, but it's in the piece. This convergence points to why for Israel or Zionism to sustain Black American support, Black Jewish solidarity must be manufactured. It's not organic. This invention is accomplished through an array of tactics, such as appeals to prosperity gospel, propensity for mission and charity, Mizrahi washing, the weaponization of anti-Semitism, and the creation of an ahistorical sense of so-called shared values and shared experiences through biblical and Holocaust tourism. So I will trace a few of those tactics now, but we unpack more on some of the other tactics in the article. So first, biblical Disney. Because of the focus on controlling a narrative, hasbara's interest is to retain the status of Israel and Zionism on the level of ahistorical and biblical fantasies. The fantasy has entailed the denial and erasure of concrete and historical Palestinian presence and links to the land. Visit to the land itself, which is one of the mechanisms designed to reinforce Christian and Jewish Zionisms, are curated as tours of a biblical Disneyland, almost indistinguishable from the vast array of Holy Land parks in the United States. A prime example is the archaeological dig of the city of David, or as it's called, in occupied East Jerusalem, sponsored mainly by American Zionist settlers or foundations and organizations, not unlike the settlement organizations that also participate in the ongoing displacement of Palestinians from their homes in their city of Jerusalem. The weaponization of the science of biblical archaeology, itself a science born in colonial frame, destroys Palestinian presence and history, demolishing layers of life in the city to make claims of Jewish indigeneity. False claims. The designs of the city have already transformed its materiality to create a biblical experience that seeks to omit and obscure Palestinian realities and histories. This erasure is accomplished, among other techniques, through constructing cable cars, for instance, that will take tourists or pilgrims from the Mount of Olives to the city of David, rerouting the entrance to the old city to bypass the site of actual Palestinian lives. Such weaponization of biblical archaeology and urban designs operates throughout Palestine, Israel, turning real places into Zionist biblical fantasies and Palestinian dislocation and nightmares. Yet biblical tourism also has dimensions that intentionally show the so-called real Israel, activating the prosperity gospel and mission, what I call mission discourse, as well as a narrative around shared Black Jewish values and experiences of suffering. So these are some of the other methodologies. Pivotal for manufacturing a narrative about Jewish Black solidarity. Constructing and maintaining biblical fantasies, therefore, are the mechanisms for enhancing Black Zionist affinity and dulling the edges of Black political consciousness. When Black American journalist and public intellectual Ta-Nehisi Coates traveled to the West Bank in the spring of 2023, he was immediately transported in his experience to the memory of Jim Crow America, inscribed on his body and his soul when he saw roads and streets for Jews only. For Black pastors, on the other hand, to travel in Palestine, Israel, and not see themselves and their intergenerational scars in the suffering of Palestinians, in the empirical realities of domination and racism, confined into ever-shrinking Bantustans, requires a significant contortion accomplished through this manufacture, a historical, fantastical readings of the biblical script and their own racialized realities. Furthermore, these pastors, as an example of some of the Black publics that are targeted through this kind of Christian Zionism, and subsequently from members in their congregations back home, affirm their solidarity with Israel through kind of this extensive and highly coordinated reporting back ambassadorial and fundraising mechanism. So I just want to kind of telegraph very quickly that there is an infrastructure of entrenching reflections and experiences from those from this tourism. Okay, so now let me go a little with some more nuance into the prosperity gospel and the real Israel kind of technology of hasbara as it as they are instrumentalized to manufacture this non-organic Black Zionist solidarity. Black Christian Zionism in America, in the US, illuminates how theopolitical resources, and we mentioned, of course, the kind of the prophecy in evangelical circles, how they are deployed to render Israel into this fantasy, redirecting Black Americans away from an analysis of racism and their political struggles and materiality. This redirection relies on a narrative about Jewish Black solidarity and the dismissal of Black Palestinian solidarity as a lie. So there is a whole kind of discourse that try to spin the long history, the long legacy of Black Palestinian solidarity as some sort of as itself some sort of a perversion. So reenacted biblical fantasies are sustained through through free or highly subsidized tourism. So tourism really cannot be underestimated in its importance of entrenching a Zionist outlook and kind of fantastical imagination. Tourism for Black pastors and others includes stops that on the surface appear to problematize an image of Israel as a fantasy. On one reported occasion, designed by the International Fellowship for Christian and Jews, so this particular instance happened in 2015, a tour itinerary for Black pastors from the Church of God of Christ included meetings in the impoverished South Tel Aviv area with African asylum seekers, mainly from Eritrea, and Ethiopian Jewish Israelis. Both are racialized, albeit differently, since Ethiopian Jews benefit from a Jewish supremacist regime. So at the time, Rabbi Eckstein, who before he died, headed the Fellowship of Christian Jews, as it's called, conveyed that the reason why, in his capacity at the time as the president, he included such unpleasant dimensions of Israeli society, of poverty and marginalization, and the reason that he highlighted was to communicate to the visitors, to the pilgrims, that he was not afraid to show a less than perfect picture of Israel. Ironically, showing the so-called real Israel contributes to entrenching the fantasy about Israel through activating the prosperity gospel or the mission religious praxis ingrained in some Black American communities. The visits was also, as he reflected on Epstein, a development opportunity too, to raise money. In practice, seeing poor Israelis, and also there are stops with like Holocaust survivors and so forth who are poor. So these are mission opportunities. And so seeing poor Israelis and helping them through charity proved impactful, just ethnographically, for Black Christian Zionist tourists. Pastors emerged from this stop in South Tel Aviv, in the impoverished neighborhood, with a resolve to help Ethiopian Jewish Israelis, leaving unasked the more penetrating questions regarding the political geography of racialization and how it connects to the history of Zionism as a European movement embedded within an interlinked colonial, settler colonial racialized logic, underpinning slavery and ongoing structures of racism in the United States. For example, Bishop J. Drush Sheard is who is the first Black American who made it in 2023. He made it to the 2023 list, which also includes former U.S. Secretary State Mike Pompeo and former right-wing populist Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro as one of the most important Christian Zionists in the world. Bolsonaro and Pompeo took first and second place in 23, respectively. And so he spoke about how impactful that visit in such visits to the real Israel, how impactful it's been. In various kind of delegations of Black pastors, we see Israeli Knesset members and other officials who welcome them with pomp and circumstance. And so on one occasion of a delegation led by Sheard and a large group from the Church of God in Christ in 2022, that also included dozens of bishops and over 150 congregants, and also a separate group, and I think this is also important, of Black women in political leadership. So they were welcomed with pomp and circumstance, as I said, by Knesset member, and in that gathering of being received by officials, like high officials from the Israeli government, Sheard remarked, quote, "Our lots are very similar when it comes to the Jews. Therefore, in order for us to get a greater appreciation for what God is getting ready to do with us, we have to come back home, meaning Israel, Zion, Palestine, and reacquaint ourselves with the word of God that has spoken to us prophetically about where we are and where we are going. End of quote from Sheard. These words by Sheard telegraph a conception of Israel as a biblical fantasy or a home that captures some sort of an authentic, prophetic, eschatological, divine message for Christians. Race is invoked abstractly through a reference to slavery and Jewish suffering, but it's at a very, very abstract level. Therefore, in addition to the motif of shared values, which also dominates outreach to white Christian Zionists, activating both the biblical imagination and Orientalist undertones of the so-called Judeo-Christian American ethos, Black outreach taps into a motif of shared suffering under oppression, which is a phrase that appears frequently in those various documents that I studied carefully. And so you see it appear by employing this romantic and selective recollection of the civil rights movement, of Jewish American activism, in addition to deploying biblical fantasies to produce an ahistorical feeling of this shared heritage. Black outreach zooms in on a narrative around shared experiences of oppression as a touchstone for Jewish Black solidarity. Throughout Black outreach, including in its Holy Land itineraries that I mentioned, there is an intentional effort to connect the Holocaust as an expression of Jewish victimhood to the history of Black slavery. This reification of victimhood as Jewish identity was apparent when a Black pastor traveler in one of the of Keough, of Christian United for Israel trips or underwritten outreach tours, remarked upon visiting Yad Vashem. So it's important to note that Holocaust tourism is a part of the broader itineraries of this Holy Land tourism. So this pastor remarked, quote, I felt even brotherhood with Jews because of our history, African-American history of being enslaved and persecuted in such an injustice. And when I went to the Holocaust Memorial, I felt that kindred spirit of a race that had gone through similar oppression as we went through, end of quote. The ahistoric and fantastic moves from a biblical narrative to a depoliticized and metaphoricized account of race and victimhood result, as sociologist Roger Bauman notes, with equating the prophetic legacy of the Black church, which is a category that is contested. It's not one thing, but we can put this point on hold. So this prophetic legacy of the Black church with Israel's struggle, targeting Black churches and other Black publics, especially youth in the United States, depends therefore on the discursive conflation of Jews with Israel, activating further the motif of Jews as the so-called chosen people. It is integral to also to a global South strategy intent on moving Israel into this ahistorical and decontextualized terrain to obscure the materiality of necropolitical violence, which racialized people can otherwise identify with intuitive clarity, as did indeed Ta-Nehisi Coates as he captures in his book, The Message. To continue to feed into an image of Israel as fantasy, thereby consenting to or actively supporting American policies underwriting an Israeli settler colonial agenda and exclusionary Jewish Zionist discourse, billed as a reclaiming, return, refugee, redemption, hasbara depends on biblical grammar and technologies such as the deployment of the prosperity gospel, shared values, shared suffering, and the so-called real Israel. And this is in addition, this is really, really important, in addition to the kind of the discussion of the actual theology that is grounded in this, the kind of the addiction, obsession with prophecy and dispensationalism. So everything that I've traced so far is really in addition to all these other more kind of theological dimensions of this. So hasbara must also transvalue a legacy, very intentionally transvalue a legacy of Black Palestinian and global South solidarity with Palestine that was explicitly stated in the initial platform of the movement for Black Lives Matter. The platform called out against the genocide of Palestinians already in 2016. This is when the platform was put forward. So this is years before the Israeli response to October 7th. Indeed, such calls show the genocidal upshot of the century-long, more than century, settler colonial project in Palestine, also articulated by those in the older generation of Black scholars and activists such as Angela Davis and Cornel West. Black outreach renders this legacy of Black Palestinian solidarity as a propaganda trap. So I'll be happy to talk more about this if people are interested, how that is accomplished. So the article, in general, illuminates the paradoxical dimensions of non-organic Black hasbara outreach, the transvaluation and branding a wrong as a right, is more than an effective public relations campaign. It is predicated on antecedent epistemic, religio-cultural, theological, and imperial forms of violence, interest, and affective interpolations. Hasbara relies on the assumption that rather than changing policies and redressing Palestinian grievances, Israel needs to come up with a more effective spin on its story. Hasbara is effective because of prophecy-obsessed eschatologies, opportunistic Christian Zionisms, the legacy of the ecumenical deal, what Mark Ellis talks about as the ecumenical deal, Islamophobia, and white supremacy. It relies on fetishizing the Jews, the so-called dead Jews, and redirecting the gaze from empirical and historical concreteness to this fantastical, apocalyptic, redemptive, ahistoric, and biblical terrains. Predicated on multiple layers of cognitive dissonance, therefore, hasbara erodes because of its historical and ethical incoherence and its inability, ultimately, to erase the massive mountains of empirical evidence that capture Palestinian experiences. So this is the hope, where this infrastructure collapsed by the weight of its own contradictions and people confronting with evidence. So the article shows that it takes a significant spin to present the oppressors in the context of Palestine, Israel, as to represent the oppressors as the victims. When this spin targets Black communities, it depends on this biblical imagination that signals the convergence between Christian and Jewish Zionist organizations and their respective agendas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Atalia, for that really brilliant exposition of your paper, and just the explanation of this very inorganic manufactured affinity between the Black church, or Black churches, not all, but some, of course, right, and Zionism. It makes me think of the city of David when you talk about sort of biblical Disneyland. I think you mentioned that in the article as well, that that archaeological space, the way it's presented. Okay, we are going to move to Dr. Thandi Gamedze for a response. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for having me. It's really an honor to be part of this important conversation alongside two scholars and human beings that I have a lot of respect and admiration for. So thank you. I think this is an important paper for so many reasons. I really appreciated reading this and hearing your comments, Atalia, and particularly thinking about this from my own South African context. I'm based in Cape Town, and thinking about the continuities, of which there are many, and the discontinuities. I think the paper raises many important things to think about in terms of how Christian Zionism is inculcated in our churches and also how it can be disrupted. So on this point, I think the paper is really important in terms of its framing of Black Christian Zionism being an interruption of what should be an organic solidarity. The idea that there has been or should be some kind of Black Palestinian solidarity positions this conversation within a structural analysis which recognizes that these are two groups of people oppressed by the same systems of power, albeit very differently. It's an analysis that recognizes the overlaps in interests and positionalities of these groups, which I think is a really useful place to start from. It positions this as a struggle of solidarities between organic solidarities among marginalized or oppressed groups, and then this manufactured solidarity between the oppressed or groups of the oppressed and the oppressor. I think it's also really useful in terms of building the question of building Palestine solidarity in these spaces, because it implies that even where this kind of solidarity is absent, there is some sort of latent or potential form that could be recovered or catalyzed or built. So there's two aspects. I mean, there's many important things that the paper raises, and I do think that people should read it when it comes out. But there's two main aspects that I just want to touch on and pull out, and one that I'll speak a little bit more about. But firstly, I think the reality outlined in the paper regarding the massive infrastructure, ideological infrastructure and otherwise that's in place and continually being tweaked and fine-tuned to manufacture this pro-Israel sentiment and action amongst Black Christians. And I think if we fail to see the intentionality and hugeness of this, then we fail to act in ways that are effective to combat it. And then secondly, so I won't speak too much about that because of time, but secondly, and what I want to explore a little bit more, is the idea and reality of depoliticization in the church and Christianity, and look at how this is created or enabled and how it functions to allow pro-Israel sentiment to take root and to thrive. So this aspect emerges from what I think is a really key point that the paper raises, namely, and Atalia quoted it now, I quote, "The more Zionist Black churches and publics are, the less politicized they are on racism in the US context." I can't speak too much to the US context, but I would say that this is true for South Africa as well. Churches that are more politicized generally are much more likely to be in active solidarity with Palestine and vice versa. And I don't think this is a coincidence. I think that this relationship between depoliticization and tendency towards Zionism is really important to analyze in terms of understanding how Christian Zionism functions, as well as how it can be addressed. I think a depoliticized faith tends to lead to and enable the sustaining and justification of a broad range of injustices, of which Christian Zionism is one. To touch on this a little bit from the South African context, because the apartheid system and ideology was underpinned by theology, it needed to be resisted using theological means. So this resulted in really powerful liberation theology and Black theology movements and interventions. However, post-1994, post-apartheid, there was broad and often deeply intentional depoliticization of civil society, including within the church. So this depoliticization led to a kind of Christianity which is captured in what the South African Kairos document calls church theology. So this refers to a kind of theology that is very much untethered from material conditions, where the structural and systemic realities are spiritualized and individualized, and where abstract biblical concepts are deployed in ways that are not grounded in any kind of social analysis, and they therefore act to perpetuate the status quo. This kind of theology also considers apoliticality and neutrality to be virtues. It's a theology that's very otherworldly and largely abstracted from the material conditions and concerns of the current context. So in this regard, in many ways, depoliticization represents a kind of untethering. So a depoliticized faith is untethered from the material realities in which it exists. Whether the material realities of today, of Black existence and struggle within a white supremacist society, or of Israeli settler colonialism, occupation, and genocide in contemporary Palestine, or the material realities of the biblical text of the brown Jesus of Palestine, born under the violent and genocidal Roman occupation. I think this kind of depoliticization and untethering then makes possible or enables a retethering to the kinds of biblical fantasies or abstracted narratives or historical fabrications of which Christian Zionism is composed and about which this paper speaks. And I think this speaks as well to one of the questions posed and unpacked in the paper that, I quote, "If Zionism is increasingly a white nationalist Christian issue, how can it also be a Black Christian issue?" And I think part of the answer to this is that neither of the Christianities of these two groups understand themselves as racialized. So the white nationalist Christianity, although it's steeped in and shaped by white nationalism, it does not position itself as such. It's portrayed as just Christianity, neutral and pure. Similarly, but with very different consequences and implications, the Christianity of Black Christians in these kinds of spaces is not understood as Black Christianity, but just as neutral and pure Christianity. This then, of course, allows the perpetuation of white nationalism to go on unimpeded because it is just guised as Christianity. It's the difference between, on one hand, a very spiritualized faith, which is untethered from material realities, in which a Black Christian is Christian before they are Black, and their Blackness is subsumed into their identity as a Christian and deemed unimportant and inconsequential. And on the other hand, a politicized faith, such as within the tradition of Black theology, where the Black body is understood as the first sacred text, and Blackness is the primary point of identity and the lens through which faith is seen and made sense of. So in this regard, I think that one of the key strategies to combat Christian support for the State of Israel is to combat the depoliticization of the Christian faith more broadly. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gamedze. That was such a fascinating and apt response. Sort of this elision of whiteness, of Blackness, of race, to have this neutral and pure Christianity, and what are the repercussions of that? I love your call for politicization of churches. All right, now let's turn to Reverend Dr. Mitri Raheb. Reverend?
Yes, thank you. It's not easy. First of all, thank you for having us on this while you are launching this institute. And I wish you all the best for this work, which is a very important work. It's very difficult to respond to my friend Atalia because she is always so eloquent. So, I can always say only amen, amen, amen when she speaks. So, but let me maybe just respond with just few points. I loved Atalia, your idea of selling biblical fantasies. And I have to say that Israel, as a state, learned this, unfortunately, from European Christians, because it was already in the 19th century that most of the Christian people who came to Palestine, actually, they were reading the Bible, first of all, as a book of history. And then they started, archaeologists, biblical archaeologists, started digging Palestine to prove this history. And all the time they were actually in mind, they had this biblical fantasy that has nothing to do with the real situation in Palestine. And in fact, almost all of the books that were written by travelers, by theologians, by archaeologists, most of them actually were guided by this biblical fantasies. So they were going to Palestine to look not for what is now there, but what has been there 2,000 years ago. And this really created our problem until this day. And you can see actually in the 19th century already how the maps that used to have Palestine on them suddenly started putting Holy Land, or the land of the Bible, and later it became Israel. And so this transformation of the map that we see that took place in the 19th, 20th century actually shows how this fantasy actually became, for many people, like a reality that they are still living with until this day. So that's my first point. My second point that I would like to make is that the Exodus story has been a very important story in Black theology, but also in liberation theology in general. And maybe this speaks to the experience of many people in Latin America and South Africa, etc. But while they were focusing on the Exodus story, the second part of that story, which is the settler colonization of Canaan or of Palestine, was somehow overseen. It was neglected. And I think there is a theological challenge for us. And this is why I think focusing now more and more on the settler colonization, that whole what we call Deuteronomistic history, the books from the book of Deuteronomy all the way to Second King. We need to focus on that, especially now when we are experiencing how these texts are becoming genocidal in nature, in the real sense of the word. So here I think we have a challenge as theologian. The third point I would like to make is that you mentioned the role of tourism in selling this fantasy and in manufacturing this non-organic fantasy. I think this is the biggest problem that we are facing in Palestine, because Israel controls tourism. 95% of tourists visiting the Holy Land they stay on the Israeli side. Only 5% of the income of tourism comes into Palestinian hands and pockets. And so all of these well-intended Christian pilgrims who go there to sing, about peace and so on, actually through their tourism are doing the biggest injustice to Palestine. And so many years ago, we started developing alternative or authentic tourism to combat that. But I mean, Israel, employs millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in selling the biblical land. And so that is another challenge we have as Palestinians when it comes to tourism. The fourth point I would like to say is that Israel took this hasbara to a new height by employing the latest technologies today, which you can see in Silwan and in other places, really where they use AI and other things to sell and to recreate a kind of a holy land for the tourists and to make it as an experiential visit. It's not something that goes through the mind, but through the heart. And you mentioned Keough, and if you watch how they do their trips in October, it's so experiential that people start, crying. They feel something is happening even to their bodies. And so Israel took this with the hasbara and with the hasbara in Israel. They have annually $185 million for this hasbara. I mean, imagine. So this is what we are facing as Palestinians. Then, if you look at white supremacy, actually, and Ashkenazi supremacy, are two sides for me of the same coin. And not many people actually speaks about it. If you look at the so-called Christian-Jewish dialogue in the West, it's white people talking to each other. You will never find, a black, Ethiopian Jews involved in these dialogues. It's white European or American people talking to each other, and they call it Christian Jewish dialogue, while actually it is a racialized dialogue. And I think we need to emphasize this more and more. And maybe the last thing is it's interesting to think maybe for another article about the role of the Black Palestinian community. As you know, we have several Black Palestinian communities, mainly in Jerusalem and in Jericho, who are an integral part of the Palestinian people, and the role they can play and they are playing in actually giving a different approach to this whole issue. Again, thank you, Atalia. Great, as usual, great article, and we always learn from you.
Thank you so much, Reverend, for that very rich response. Dr. Omer, Atalia, would you like to respond to them? And then we're running out of time, but maybe we could do one or two quick questions. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you both. I mean, just I agree with everything you said. Yeah, I mean, the point about Thandi's point about you really picked on that issue of the move to depoliticization, which of course has profound political implications. Yeah, it's something that has really analytically, and also in terms of my commitment and kind of what the ethical drive for this scholarship is a major point, because of how specifically religion can be deployed to depoliticize communities, and also estrange them in this particular case from their actual experience of racialization, of slavery, of and also that, yeah, the more organic potentialities for solidarity. This is a really important point with respect to Mitri's analysis, and this the legacy of selling biblical fantasies that you've highlighted, of course, connecting to, but really at the center of it is Orientalism and Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism. And often those issues, those conversations are bracketed from an analysis of Christian Zionism, and it really is critical to bring them back in. And in fact, in the context of the US now, they are brought in very clearly in this one document, Project Esther, which is this addendum document for Project 2025 that was produced by very opportunistically by the Heritage Foundation, but is already enacted in the US, really converging the methodologies of, that were developed for 20 years plus during the so-called war on terrorism, and this anti-Semitism, the weaponization of anti-Semitism. And so we see it enacted very much. And so this is just to really stress the importance of interrogating Orientalism and Islamophobia in thinking about Christian Zionism and how it operates in Zionism broadly. But I also want to go to the point about, which I completely agree. I mean, this Ashkenazi, Zionism, Jewish Zionism emerged in Europe. It's embedded in Europe as a project, as a theological project, as an intellectual project, as a political project, as a genocidal project. Zionism, which to be distinguished from Zion as a theological, spiritual category, is a modern European movement and discourse that in fact really reflects internalization of, including of anti-Semitism as well. So I completely agree with your really powerful point about white supremacy is the same as is connected it's the other side of, or Ashkenazi supremacy is the other side of white supremacy. But one thing that is really that I try to highlight in the piece, and I want to also continue to work on, is how organization like KUFI, Christian United for Israel, is actually using Mizrahi, the experience of Mizrahi Jews, Arab Jews, in order to well, it's what what is called like Mizrahi washing or brown washing, how they use this, their histories of, being, dislocated from, let's say, Iraq or Morocco or whatnot, as a way to challenge the Palestinian experience of being uprooted, depopulated. So it really is important to trace how discursively Arab Jews are used, how Ethiopian Jewish Israelis are used, which I try to kind of telegraph it in my presentation about that stop in the real Israel, where you see, but then the connections are not being made between the experience, like, the kind of the Ta-Nehisi Coates instinctive experience without a lot of knowledge about the context. It's like, oh, I'm connected. I go to Palestine and I immediately transported to Jim Crow America. And why is it not happening? What kind of and so it is also important to highlight how the kind of the discursive move to complexify by manipulating kind of the narratives of marginalized non-Ashkenazi experiences, and also to see how those some in these communities themselves participate in this kind of weaponization of their history. So it's really important not to take away people's agency and how they participate in, because the truth is that Ethiopian Israeli Jews and Arab Jews, Mizrahi Jews, absolutely participate in the settler colonial frame. So often there is a move, again, kind of an ahistorical move to, 1948 or 1950, when, where the Arab Jews were all of a sudden were kind of relocated to Palestine, Israel. But what is often excluded from the analysis is this like decades of history of becoming a part of this framework and actively participating in it.
Can I maybe just say one thing to something that Thandi said, if I may, about the depoliticized theology? Actually, these so-called depoliticized communities are the most politicized.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think we need to think about this dynamic. They sell this fantasy as if they are depolitical, looking for the pure gospel, but this is the most the most politicized communities. And again, that's a challenge I think we need to crack.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
That's such a great point. Anything else from the speakers, Dr. Gamedze? Did you have anything you wanted to add before we go to questions?
It's just quite something to see, I think, all the ins and outs of the machinery of propaganda. And I think this is really important work to be analyzing it and recognizing it and naming it. And also how it moves and changes and adjusts over time, targets different groups of people and different contexts. And it's wild to me how it all hangs together, because of course there's so much in opposition and so much contestation within the whole thing, but somehow it holds together in getting different groups on board to the Zionist project. So yeah, I just think it's really important work to recognize how it's happening. I think the one thing you spoke about a little bit was the way that the legacy, a kind of decontextualized legacy of Martin Luther King, and how that's kind of weaponized in various ways. And I mean, in the South African context, you would be shocked to see the ways that the legacies of Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu, who were very clear in their solidarity with Palestine and their recognition of Israeli apartheid, but still the memories of these figures are again appropriated and deployed in strategic ways in order to further this agenda. So yeah, I think it's really important in, I guess, training our analysis to really see these things and call them out as they're happening so that we can address them more effectively.
Thank you. Great point. Let's just do one question, I think, and this is a kind of a detailed, sort of more pointed question, and I'm thinking about, maybe we end on something that we can all do, or that we're, thinking about strategies. So Don Wagner, who is a treasured member of our team at the Institute, writes, "Thank you all for the brilliant presentations. I'm reminded that South African theologians were able to have apartheid theology denounced as a heresy, or the technical term status confessionists. Can this strategy be pursued to have Christian Zionism declared a status confessionist? I think Palestinian Christians have raised this. This will not be easy, as many of the major church bodies are trapped with a subservience to the anti-Semitism critique. What did the speakers think of this?" So that's our,
I mean, I would, absolutely want to give the stage to Mitri, but I'll just say that I'm all for it, but I also want to underscore the fact that it's so much more than just. I mean, it's interrogating and the theological challenges, all those are extremely critical. But part of what we've, I think the importance of this kind of institute and the journal is really to trace how it operates, the power and the various opportunistic forces that couldn't care less about the prophecy. That's the truth. And this, I really also want to thank my friend and colleague Nadia Shalov-Kevorkian, who gathered some of us to really try to think and interrogate and trace the kind of the topographies and cartographies of Christian Zionism as it operates on the level of like power, the materiality, this infrastructure, like even what Mitri talked about with the industry of tourism. So those questions are really important, and there are Christian forces that are Zionists as opportunistically in order to promote other agendas, including assault on everybody else, including Jews. By the way, I mean, we see it really enacted in the U.S. right now, how particular kind of Zionism. That equates Jews with Israel is deployed in order to basically engage in an overall assault on kind of and a whole set of regressive policies, an assault on LGBTQI plus people, the academy, any kind of on poor people, on disabled people, and so. So this is just to say that it really is important to also capture how the opportunistic forces and the convergences of all different kind of forces in that Zionist space. And of course, it takes us away from the actual ongoing genocide. I mean, it's also diversion technology. But Mitri.
Yeah, I mean, I think many Christian theologians challenge churches to think of what's happening and to call for status confessiones, which means, this is like a decisive moment that distinguish the real church from, heresy and so on. The problem is what Atalia talked about by quoting, the late friend Mark Ellis about the ecumenical deal. Actually, the ecumenical deal is preventing the church from doing this. This is really the problem. I mean, last month was the commemoration day of Bonhoeffer, who called for that, he paid with his life for that stand that he took against Nazi Germany, and he is celebrated almost as a saint, though Lutherans, they don't have these kinds of saints. Everyone is a saint somehow, or everyone is insane maybe. But nobody, he's celebrated, but nobody want to walk in his shoes because it's a costly solidarity. I'm talking about the church hierarchy. So they talk about him, they celebrate him, but nobody dared to take that stand because, it cost you a lot. And I think everyone here, I mean, Don Wagner have experienced that, how costly that can be. Atalia is experiencing that. I'm experiencing that. And many of our friends here maybe have experienced that. So, again, walking the talk is still, I would say, the challenge, but we should not give up. Keep pushing the envelope.
Yeah, thank you. Well, that's a good note to end on, and let's keep doing it together, and bring more along with us. So thank you all so much. This was such a rich and important discussion, and was an honor to do this with you. And I look forward to more with the Institute and beyond. So want to let everybody go. Thank you all again. We'll continue the discussion.
Thank you.